America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Essential William James, edited by John Shook. This is a compilation of some of William James's writings, and I will have a few particular essays in here that I want to look at. Like most of these sorts of compilations, it pulls a little bit out of his major writings and scatters some of his essays and a few of his lesser-known writings in here as well. So you get a little bit of the popular stuff and a little bit of the harder-to-find essays. And there are 3 essays in here that I want to draw your attention to. Those 3 are What is an Emotion, The Function of Cognition, and The Dilemma of Determinism. These 3 essays were all written in 1884. So the last time I looked at William James was a few episodes ago. I looked at the book The Will to Believe, which itself was a collection of essays. And the one that I focused on in that episode was The Sentiment of Rationality. And The Sentiment of Rationality was one of his very first major writings, one of his first published writings. And it was written in 1879 to 1880, partly completed in the first year and partly completed in the second year. And that was just after Charles Peirce had published his writings that really initiated the pragmatic conversation. So this is only a few years later. This is 4 years later. And at this time, he was an assistant professor of philosophy at Harvard. But he was still studying and writing psychology as well. Physiology. I believe he entered Harvard as a professor of physiology, then psychology, philosophy. He kind of bounced around between psychology and philosophy. 1884 was still before he had written his landmark psychology textbook, Principles of Psychology. That was in 1890. His career basically was started more in the realm of psychology and over time entered more into philosophy. These are 3, as I said, somewhat early essays, 1884. This is still somewhat early in his career. And the one of them I want to focus on particularly is The Dilemma of Determinism. The other 2 I'll read a little bit from, but I don't want to dwell on those other 2 very much. The first of them that I'll mention is What is an Emotion? And I think in this essay, What is an Emotion, as well as in the next essay, The Function of Cognition, there is some components in these writings that would indicate some sort of determinism, or at least hint at a bit of determinism in human behavior. As I said previously, he was studying the human mind, and he was coming across all sorts of instincts and all sorts of hardwired behaviors and habits, and really kind of beginning to understand the brain as a machine, or as similar to a machine in his studies at this time. And he had kind of committed himself to free will, but I think he was struggling with the question of how free will is possible with a brain that is so structurally determined, and instincts that guide all of our behavior. And so this was an ongoing question. As I said, he talked about it early on, and he continued to talk about it through his whole life. And ultimately, he decided that he was not a determinist, but it was something that he felt was important enough to address in a lot of his writings. So like all my episodes, I'm going to read a few sections and provide some commentary. The first part I want to read is when he talks from What is an Emotion. He talks about what emotion is. His theory basically is that what we conceive of our emotions as like mental states that prompt us to behave in a certain way. We acquire this mental state of an emotion. Perhaps it's anger, and that anger causes our body to like flush our we get adrenaline rush. We get kind of agitated, red in the face, and can't stand still. We're angry. Or we're sad and we might cry, we look down, or whatever it may be. You're afraid, you turn, you run, your pulse quickens. There's physical effects of your emotions. And his theory was, well, wait a minute, if you strip away all of the physical effects, what's left? Nothing, really. Just a cognition, a mental awareness of the fact that you're angry, or the fact that some circumstance has happened that should prompt anger in you. But the emotion itself doesn't exist when you strip away all of the various physical effects, which is an interesting theory, an interesting question. I don't know how much this has been borne out over the years by any study on emotions. I think that it's very speculative, and I'm not so sure that he actually is correct in this. But it definitely shows that he was asking questions about, how much of our mental state really is what we think it is, versus how much of it is just biological phenomenon. So here he says, quote, "Our natural way of thinking about standard emotions is that the mental perception of some fact excites the mental affection called the emotion, and that this latter state of mind gives rise to the bodily expression. My thesis, on the contrary, is that the bodily changes follow directly from the perception of the exciting fact, and that our feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion. Common sense says, we lose our fortune, are sorry, and weep. We meet a bear, are frightened, and run. We are insulted by a rival, are angry, and strike. The hypothesis here to be defended says that this order of sequence is incorrect, that the one mental state is not immediately induced by the other, that the bodily manifestations must first be interposed between, and that the more rational statement is that we feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble, and not that we cry, strike, or tremble because we are sorry, angry, or fearful, as the case may be. Without the bodily states following on the perception, the latter would be purely cognitive in form, pale, colorless, destitute of emotional warmth. We might then see the bear, and judge it best to run, receive the insult, and deem it right to strike, but we could not actually feel afraid or angry. Stated in this crude way, the hypothesis is pretty sure to meet with immediate disbelief. And yet neither many nor far-fetched considerations are required to mitigate its paradoxical character, and possibly to produce conviction of its truth. To begin with, readers of the journal do not need to be reminded that the nervous system of every living thing is but a bundle of predispositions to react in particular ways upon the contact of particular features of the environment. As surely as the hermit crab's abdomen presupposes the existence of empty whelk shells somewhere to be found, so surely do the hound's olfactories imply the existence on the one hand of deer's or fox's feet, and on the other the tendency to follow up their tracks. The neural machinery is but a hyphen between determinate arrangements of matter outside the body and determinate impulses to inhibition or discharge within its organs. When the hen sees a white oval object on the ground, she cannot leave it. She must keep upon it and return to it, until at last its transformation into a little mass of moving, chirping down elicits from her machinery an entirely new set of performances. The love of man for woman, or of the human mother for her babe, our wrath at snakes and our fear of precipices, may all be described similarly as instances of the way in which peculiarly conformed pieces of the world's furniture will fatally call forth the most particular mental and bodily reactions in advance of, and often in direct opposition to, the verdict of our deliberate reason concerning them. The labors of Darwin and his successors are only just beginning to reveal the universal parasitism of each creature upon other special things, and the way in which each creature brings the signature of its special relations stamped on its nervous system with it upon the scene. Every living creature is in fact a sort of lock, whose wards and springs presuppose special forms of keys, which keys, however, are not born attached to the locks, but are sure to be found in the world nearby as life goes on. And the locks are indifferent to any but their own keys. The egg fails to fascinate the hound. The bird does not fear the precipice. The snake waxes not wroth at his kind. The deer cares nothing for the woman or the human babe. End quote. Okay, so that's not a super long section, but I think there's a lot packed in there. Just stepping aside from his thesis here about the emotions, there's just some things that he says there that I think are important. First of all, that the nervous system of every living thing is but a bundle of predispositions to react in particular ways upon the contact of particular features of the environment. That's a pretty important statement. The entire nervous system, which includes the brain and everything else in your nervous system, but primarily your brain. I mean, your brain is the central nervous system. It is nothing but a bundle. I mean, that's what he says. It is but a bundle of predispositions, meaning it's nothing else other than a bundle of predispositions to react in particular ways upon the contact of particular features of the environment. So that your brain is nothing but a bundle of predispositions. And that he says here, the neural machinery is but a hyphen between determinate arrangements of matter outside the body and determinate impulses to inhibition or discharge within its organs. Doesn't that sound like determinism? That the environment is determined according to the arrangements of matter outside the body, and the internal activity is also determinate. And that when the hen sees the egg, she cannot leave it. She must keep upon it and return to it. She's driven to do so by her instincts. She doesn't choose, doesn't decide to sit on the egg. The love of man for woman or the human mother for her babe, the same thing. Described similarly, wrath at snakes, fear of precipices. We don't choose to be afraid of heights. It just happens. These are things that are just hardwired into us. And so I just think that's really interesting because he does seem like he's kind of advocating for a sort of mental determinism. We just respond in certain ways to certain things, and it's not a matter of choice. So as you can see, I think it's true that he is wrestling here. It's not quite as clear-cut as he might like to make it in his essay on determinism, where he argues against determinism. I think it's something that philosophically he might say determinism doesn't make sense philosophically, but biologically it sure looks that way, doesn't it? So let me jump to the next essay that I wanted to look at, The Function of Cognition. Like I said, these are all 1884 essays. And this one is more of a, you would think the function of cognition, it's kind of psychological, but it's really very philosophical here. And I don't want to get into a lot of the details. He basically is proposing, just to give the short and sweet of it, that imagine a disembodied mind that has only one thought. And that thought is, he doesn't want to get too explicit with what the thought is. He just says Q. Just imagine a thing, a variable, like X, He just uses Q as a variable. It's just something that this disembodied mind is thinking. And so then the question becomes, is Q what it is thinking about, or is Q just the entirety and the quality of the thought? What would it have to be for it to be thinking about Q as opposed to just thinking the thought Q alone on its own? And he says, okay, well, imagine that in this sort of, let's say, a parallel universe or something where nothing exists but the mind and the thought of Q. Well, imagine if added into this world there was some other thing, Q. In that case, does the mind at that point, is this thought of Q? Is the mind thinking about Q? And is the mind thinking about the Q that exists external to itself? What would have to be the case to say that this is a thought about Q? And I think clearly it would have to be a relationship between the mind and Q. If the mind just thinks Q, and that's all it is, it's not thinking about Q, it's just thinking of Q-ness, and then you were to make Q appear in this reality, but it's a billion miles away, has the mind now suddenly thinking about Q? It would have to have some relationship to Q, have seen it, or anticipate seeing it, or somehow be in relation with the component of reality that is what the thought is thinking of. And so he comes through, this is kind of an epistemological question, and it's a question about knowing whether and how our mind connects to the world around us. And it's an interesting thought. He breaks it down into like percepts and concepts. It's interesting, but I don't want to get into this in an awful lot of detail. I just want to read toward the very end, kind of the conclusion that he draws about all of this. So I'm basically just going to read like the end of this essay, because he doesn't really get down to, at the end of the day, what the function of cognition really is. He spends more of this essay trying to uncover what it means to think about something, what cognition is, what a concept is, as opposed to a percept. And he doesn't really get into what the function of it is, but he kind of hints at the function of cognition at the end. And that's where I want to read from the last few pages of this essay, where he says, quote, "In the last analysis, we believe that we all know and think about and talk about the same world, because we believe our percepts are possessed by us in common. And we believe this because the percepts of each one of us seem to be changed in consequences of changes in the percepts of someone else. What I am for you is, in the first instance, a percept of your own. Unexpectedly, however, I open and show you a book, uttering certain sounds the while. These acts are also your percepts, but they so resemble acts of yours, with feelings prompting them, that you cannot doubt I have the feelings too, or that the book is one book felt in both our worlds. That it is felt in the same way, that my feelings of it resemble yours, is something of which we can never be sure, but which we assume as the simplest hypothesis that meets the case. As a matter of fact, we never are sure of it. And as an epistemologist, we can only say that of feelings that should not resemble each other, both could not know the same thing at the same time in the same way. If each holds to its own percept as the reality, it is bound to say of the other percept that, though it may intend that reality, and prove this by working change upon it, yet if it do not resemble it, it is all false and wrong. If this be so of percepts, how much more so of higher modes of thought? Even in the sphere of sensation, individuals are probably different enough. Comparative study of the simplest conceptual elements seems to show a wider divergence still. And when it comes to the general theories and emotional attitudes towards life, it is indeed time to say with Thackeray, my friend, a different universe walks about under your hat and under mine. What can save us at all, and prevent us from flying asunder into a chaos of mutually repellent solipsisms? Through what can our several minds commune? Through nothing but the mutual resemblance of those of our feelings which have this strange power of modifying each other, which are mere dumb knowledges of acquaintance, and which must also resemble their realities, or not know them aright at all. In such pieces of knowledge of acquaintance, all our knowledge about must end, and carry a sense of this possible termination as part of its content. These percepts, these termini, these sensible things, these mere matters of acquaintance, are the only realities we ever directly know, and the whole history of our thought is the history of our substitution of one of them for another, and the reduction of the latter to the status of a conceptual sign. Condemned though they may be by some thinkers, these sensations are the Mother Earth, the anchorage, the stable rock, the first and last limits, the terminus a quo and the terminus ad quem of the mind. To find such sensational termini should be our aim with all our highest thought. They end discussion. They destroy the false conceit of knowledge, and without them we are all at sea with each other's meaning. If two men act alike on a percept, they believe themselves to feel alike about it. If not, they may suspect they know it in differing ways. We can never be sure we understand each other till we are able to bring the matter to this test. This is why metaphysical discussions are so much like fighting with the air. They have no practical issue of a sensational kind. Scientific theories, on the other hand, always terminate in definite percepts. You can deduce a possible sensation from your theory, and taking me into your laboratory, prove that your theory is true of my world by giving me the sensation then and there. Beautiful is the flight of conceptual reason through the upper air of truth. No wonder philosophers are dazzled by it still, and no wonder they look with some disdain at the low earth of feeling from which the goddess launched herself aloft. But woe to her if she return not home to its acquaintance. Every crazy wind will take her, and like a fire balloon at night, she will go out among the stars. End quote. So as you can probably gather, that's a little bit, in a way, kind of tricky to understand. And there is one other section here that I want to read. It's a little bit before that. He's talking about how one person can trust that another person is experiencing the world in the same way, that someone else is basically seeing the same thing that he's seeing, living in the same world that he's living in. It might seem obvious that we're all living in the same world, we're all sharing the world together, but what is it that makes us so sure of that? What is it that makes us believe that we're all living in the same world? He postulates a sort of what he calls a psychological critic, and he says his psychological critic trusts that he acknowledges that his reality is the same as William James's reality. The psychological critic's reality and William James's reality are one reality. And he says, why does my psychological critic trust this to be true? And he says, what justifies my critic in being as lenient as this singularly inadequate consciousness of mine, made up of symbols that neither resemble nor affect the realities they stand for? How can he be sure it is cognizant of the very realities he himself has in mind? He is sure because, in countless like cases, he has seen such inadequate and symbolic thoughts, by developing themselves, terminate in percepts that practically modified and presumably resembled his own. By developing themselves is meant obeying their tendencies, following up the suggestions nascently present in them, working in the direction in which they seem to point, clearing up the penumbra, making distinct the halo, unraveling the fringe, which is part of their composition, and in the midst of which their more substantive kernel of subjective content seems consciously to lie. So, this is not a particularly easy essay to follow along with, but he's basically saying that, experience has shown his psychological critic that when one person starts talking about things or going off on something that's not directly related to what is directly in front of him and a perceptual thing, when someone's talking about concepts, that it always seems to be able to come back to something that is tangible. If a person says, "Here, have a glass of water," and it's someone that I trust to not lie to me, and I take the glass of water from them, and I drink from it, I find that there's water in it. I find that what I'm holding is a glass of water, just like they said it was. Obviously, that's not quite as conceptual, but the same process stands, that when someone says 2 + 2 = 4, I can go and I can, add up the pencils on my desk, 2 of them, and then another 2 of them, and find that I have 4 of them. In other words, it always comes back to being verifiable by the psychological critic, and so that he trusts that the other person is talking about the same world as him, even though we can't connect mind to mind with one another and have some sort of absolute certainty. He says we don't ever really have this total certainty, but we have to trust it. And it's verified every time that we trust someone else's statement about the world and then act on it and find that it aligns with our own vision of the world. So there's not a lot that I want to go into here. This is some epistemological questions about how we know things. But I do sort of appreciate the fact that it talks about the results, how we know that we are all kind of sharing one experience, because when we act on that, it verifies itself. Through our actions in the world, we verify the things that other people say. We trust each other in that way, despite the fact that we don't necessarily have some philosophically exact mechanism of connecting the subject and the object or what have you, or connecting the two minds of two different people. In practice, in the world, we live as though we all share a world because it works, because it's functional. And so, that's kind of the hints at his early pragmatism. And that kind of hints at the function of cognition, insofar as it seems to be about communicating with people. He gives the example of the book. He says, if I open a book and I start reading from it, you'll look at the book that I'm reading from and you'll see the same thing, and you'll translate those scribbly lines in the same way that I translate those scribbly lines. And so even as we move, that's a percept, but even as you move into the realm of the abstract, where you hear the words I'm saying and the vocals, and it's just noises and mouth movements and air coming out of my mouth, and yet you understand it in a way that you could respond back to me, and I would understand you, and we could have a conversation about something that neither of us can see or touch, and we can both understand each other. So I'm not going to dig any further into this somewhat challenging essay, other than to just say that it does seem at this early point in his career that he is talking a lot about the mind and its function. There are hints of determinism, and much of his discussion comes back to how our minds interact with the physical world and how it is our minds exist for somewhat perhaps mundane purposes. And with that said, I want to move to the dilemma of determinism. I myself am a determinist, and so I find this particularly interesting. William James is not, and I guess I can understand why he's not, as he explains in this essay, and it makes sense. But I think that he's missing some important aspects of the situation. Let's see what he has to say about it. He says, quote, "What does determinism profess? It professes that those parts of the universe already laid down absolutely appoint and decree what the other parts shall be. The future has no ambiguous possibilities bidden in its womb. The part we call the present is compatible with only one totality. Any other future complement than the one fixed from eternity is impossible. The whole is in each and every part, and welds it with the rest into an absolute unity, an iron block, in which there can be no equivocation or shadow of turning. Indeterminism, on the contrary, says that parts have a certain amount of loose play on one another, so that the laying down of one of them does not necessarily determine what the others shall be. It admits that possibilities may be in excess of actualities, and that things not yet revealed to our knowledge may really in themselves be ambiguous. Of two alternative futures which we conceive, both may now be really possible, and the one becomes impossible only at the very moment when the other excludes it by becoming real itself. Indeterminism thus denies the world to be one unbending unit of fact. It says there is a certain ultimate pluralism in it, and so saying, it corroborates our ordinary unsophisticated view of things. To that view, actualities seem to float in a wider sea of possibilities from out of which they are chosen. And somewhere, indeterminism says, such possibilities exist and form a part of truth. Determinism, on the contrary, says they exist nowhere, and that necessity on the one hand and impossibility on the other are the sole categories of the real. Possibilities that fail to get realized are, for determinism, pure illusions. They never were possibilities at all. There is nothing inchoate, it says, about this universe of ours. All that was or is or shall be actual in it, having been from eternity virtually there. The cloud of alternatives our minds escort this mass of actuality withal is a cloud of sheer deceptions, to which impossibilities is the only name that rightfully belongs. The issue, it will seem, is a perfectly sharp one, which no eulogistic terminology can smear over or wipe out. The truth must lie with one side or the other, and its lying with one side makes the other false. The question relates solely to the existence of possibilities, in the strict sense of the term, as things that may, but need not, be. Both sides admit that a volition, for instance, has occurred. The indeterminists say another volition might have occurred in its place. The determinists swear that nothing could possibly have occurred in its place. Now, can science be called in to tell us which of these two point-blank contradictors of each other is right? Science professes to draw no conclusions, but such as are based on matters of fact, things that have actually happened. But how can any amount of assurance that something actually happened give us the least grain of information as to whether another thing might or might not have happened in its place? Only facts can be proved by other facts. With things that are possibilities and not facts, facts have no concern. If we have no other evidence than the evidence of existing facts, the possibility question must remain a mystery never to be cleared up. And the truth is that facts, practically, have hardly anything to do with making us either determinists or indeterminists. Sure enough, we make a flourish of quoting facts this way or that, and if we are determinists, we talk about the infallibility with which we can predict one another's conduct, while if we are indeterminists, we lay great stress on the fact that it is just because we cannot foretell one another's conduct, either in war or statecraft, or any of the great and small intrigues and businesses of men, that life is so intensely anxious and hazardous a game. But who does not see the wretched insufficiency of this so-called objective testimony on both sides? What fills up the gaps in our minds is something not objective, not external. What divides us into possibility men and anti-possibility men is different faiths or postulates, postulates of rationality. To this man, the world seems more rational with possibilities in it. To that man, more rational with possibilities excluded. And talk as we will about having to yield to evidence, what makes us monists or pluralists determinists or indeterminists is at bottom always some sentiment like this. End quote. Okay, so he is putting forward his two competing ideas of determinism and indeterminism. And determinism basically saying that everything that's possible is bound up in the existing world, and everything that's going to happen is determined by what the current state of things is and what has happened already, and there's no other possibilities. There is what will happen, there is what has happened, and then there's the realm of impossible. Whereas the indeterminist, as he calls it, believes in a whole host of possibilities, that all sorts of things may happen in the future. Things that went one way may have gone a different way, but they didn't. And he says that science doesn't really have anything to say about it because science is only drawn on facts and things that have happened. But I think that that's selling the story a little short. If you drop a ball from a certain height, particularly in a vacuum, it'll fall at a certain speed, at a certain rate. It'll hit the ground at a certain time based on when you dropped it. And those things are not up for dispute, that if it fell at a certain time, you couldn't say, well, it might have fallen at a different time. It might have done things differently. But it really might not have. There are laws, there are rules and laws to how things unfold. And that on a molecular level, when you subject a certain compound to certain stimulus, certain things happen. Chemistry is very deterministic. And human beings are chemical entities. And our brains work certain ways, just like he talked about regarding the hen and the egg. The hen is driven to do that by no choice of its own. Is it possible that the hen would not sit on the egg? Well, it's possible, but it's probably only possible if there's some sort of defect in the hen's brain or some other aspect of the hen or some other environmental factor that is overwhelming the instinct to sit on the egg. But the factors that would go into the decision of the hen to sit on the egg are all already in place. The hen doesn't choose to do it. And I think that the same thing applies to human beings. So let's move on to a few pages later where he says, quote, "Even from the point of view of our own ends, we should probably make a botch of remodeling the universe. How much more, then, from the point of view of ends we cannot see? Wise men, therefore, regret as little as they can, but still some regrets are pretty obstinate and hard to stifle. Regrets for acts of wanton cruelty or treachery, for example, whether performed by others or by ourselves. Hardly anyone can remain entirely optimistic. After reading the confession of the murderer at Brockton the other day, how, to get rid of the wife whose continued existence bored him, he inveigled her into a desert spot, shot her 4 times, and then, as she lay on the ground and said to him, 'You didn't do it on purpose, did you, dear?' replied, 'No, I didn't do it on purpose,' as he raised a rock and smashed her skull. Such an occurrence, with the mild sentence and self-satisfaction of the prisoner, is a field for a crop of regrets which one need not take up in detail. We feel that, although a perfect mechanical fit to the rest of the universe, it is a bad moral fit, and that something else would really have been better in its place. But for the deterministic philosophy, the murderer, the sentence, and the prisoner's optimism were all necessary from eternity, and nothing else for a moment had a ghost of a chance of being put in their place. To admit such a chance, the determinists tell us, would be to make a suicide of reason. So we must steel our hearts against the thought. And here our plot thickens, for we see the first of those difficult implications of determinism and monism, which it is my purpose to make you feel. If this Brockton murder was called for by the rest of the universe, if it had to come at its pre-appointed hour, and if nothing else would have been consistent with the sense of the whole, what are we to think of the universe? Are we stubbornly to stick to our judgment of regret and say, though it couldn't be, yet it would have been a better universe, with something different from this Brockton murder in it? That, of course, seems the natural and spontaneous thing for us to do, and yet it is nothing short of deliberately espousing a kind of pessimism. The judgment of regret calls the murder bad. Calling a thing bad means, if it means anything at all, that the thing ought not to be, that something else ought to be in its stead. Determinism, in denying that anything else can be in its stead, virtually defines a universe as a place in which what ought to be is impossible. In other words, as an organism whose constitution is afflicted with an incurable taint, an irremediable flaw. The pessimism of a Schopenhauer says no more than this, that the murder is a symptom, and that it is a vicious symptom, because it belongs to a vicious whole, which can express its nature no otherwise than by bringing forth just such a symptom as that at this particular spot. Regret for the murder must transform itself, if we are determinists and wise, into a larger regret. It is absurd to regret the murder alone. Other things being what they are, it could not be different. What we should regret is that whole frame of things, of which the murder is one member. I see no escape whatever from this pessimistic conclusion, if, being determinists, our judgment of regret is to be allowed to stand at all. End quote. Okay, so now we get into the interesting stuff. So he basically says, wise people don't go around regretting everything that they've done. We're not perfect. We couldn't build a perfect universe, and so we shouldn't regret that this happened or that happened. But sometimes you can't help but think this should not have been. Something different should have occurred. And he recites a murder of a particularly cruel sort, and says, we generally must think that this shouldn't have happened. It would be better if this had not happened. But if you're a determinist, then you think that there was never any other choice but for that to happen. It must have happened that way. And so the pessimistic view that you must adopt is that it's not that that should have happened a different way. It's that the whole universe itself should have happened a different way. But it didn't. The universe that we live in is one in which things like that happen. And there's no two ways about it. There's no end run. There's no other way of having the universe. There is no other universe to have. And so there's a sort of pessimism that we're stuck in a universe that is less than what it should be, and we're stuck in a universe in which horrible things happen, and it's a sort of pessimism. And maybe it is pessimism, but I'm of the mind myself that it's a reasonable pessimism, and perhaps pessimism itself is simply a frame of mind that we have acquired, that somehow things like that shouldn't happen, and that we have the capacity to prevent them from happening. And to, late in the game, come to the awakening that there is no other way for it to be. That's not to say that, all of the implications that, a lot of people try to attach to such quote-unquote pessimistic determinism, that, we shouldn't do anything to prevent murders from happening because they're just going to happen anyway. That's not really like intelligent determinism. Intelligent determinism doesn't throw its hands in the air and say, well, there's no choice but streets filled with murdering, rampaging psychopaths. It's just the way of the world. Let's just accept it. That's not determinism. It's not just accepting all of the brutality of the world and saying there's nothing we can do about it. It's just the way it is. And I don't think that that's what William James is accusing determinists of, but he is accusing them of accepting a sort of pessimistic view of the world. Let's move on from there. He says, quote, "To escape pessimism is, as we all know, no easy task. Your own studies have sufficiently shown you the almost desperate difficulty of making the notion that there is a single principle of things, and that principle absolute perfection, rhyme together with our daily vision of the facts of life. If perfection be the principle, how comes there any imperfection here? If God be good, how came he to create? Or if he did not create, how comes he to permit the devil? The evil facts must be explained as seeming. The devil must be whitewashed. The universe must be disinfected, if neither God's goodness nor his unity and power are to remain impugned. And of all the various ways of operating the disinfection and making bad seem less bad, the way of subjectivism appears by far the best. For, after all, is there not something rather absurd in our ordinary notion of external things being good or bad in themselves? Can murders and treacheries, considered as mere outward happenings, or motions of matter, be bad without anyone to feel their badness? And could paradise properly be good in the absence of a sentient principle by which the goodness was perceived? Outward goods and evils seem practically indistinguishable, except insofar as they result in getting moral judgments made about them. But then the moral judgments seem the main thing, and the outward facts mere perishing instruments for their production. This is subjectivism. Everyone must at some time have wondered at that strange paradox of our moral nature, that though the pursuit of outward good is the breath of its nostrils, the attainment of outward good would seem to be its suffocation and death. Why does the painting of any paradise or utopia, in heaven or on earth, awaken such yearnings for nirvana and escape? The white-robed, harp-playing heaven of our Sabbath schools and the ladylike tea-table Elysium represented in Mr. Spencer's Data of Ethics as the final consummation of progress are exactly on a par in this respect. Lubberlands, pure and simple, one and all. We look upon them from this delicious mess of insanities and realities, strivings and deadnesses, hopes and fears, agonies and exultations, which forms our present state, and tedium vitae is the only sentiment they awaken in our breasts. To our crepuscular natures, born for the conflict, the Rembrandt-esque moral chiaroscuro, the shifting struggle of the sunbeam and the gloom, such pictures of light upon light are vacuous and expressionless, and neither to be enjoyed nor understood. If this be the whole fruit of the victory, we say, if the generations of mankind suffered and laid down their lives, if prophets confessed and martyrs sang in the fire, and all the sacred tears were shed for no other end than that a race of creatures of such unexampled insipidity should succeed, and protract in secula seculorum their contented and inoffensive lives, why, at such a rate, better lose than win the battle, or at all events, better ring down the curtain before the last act of the play, so that a business that began so importantly may be saved from so singularly flat a winding up. All this is what I should instantly say were I called on to plead for Gnosticism, and its real friends, of whom you will presently perceive I am not one, would say without difficulty a great deal more. Regarded as a stable finality, every outward good becomes a mere weariness to the flesh. It must be menaced, be occasionally lost, for its goodness to be fully felt as such. nay, more than occasionally lost. No one knows the worth of innocence till he knows it is gone forever, and that money cannot buy it back. Not the saint, but the sinner that repenteth, is he to whom the full length and breadth and height and depth of life's meaning is revealed. Not the absence of vice, but vice there, and virtue, holding her by the throat, seems the ideal human state. And there seems no reason to suppose it not a permanent human state. There is a deep truth in what the school of Schopenhauer insists on, the illusoriness of the notion of moral progress. The more brutal forms of evil that go are replaced by others more subtle and more poisonous. Our moral horizon moves with us as we move, and never do we draw nearer to the far-off line where the black waves and the azure meet. The final purpose of our creation seems most plausibly to be the greatest possible enrichment of our ethical consciousness through the intensest play of contrasts and the widest diversity of characters. This, of course, obliges some of us to be vessels of wrath, while it calls others to be vessels of honor. But the subjectivist point of view reduces all these outward distinctions to a common denominator. The wretch, languishing in the felon's cell, may be drinking draughts of the wine of truth that will never pass the lips of the so-called favorite of fortune. And the peculiar consciousness of each of them is an indispensable note in the great ethical concert which the centuries, as they roll, are grinding out of the living heart of man. So much for subjectivism. If the dilemma of determinism be to choose between it and pessimism, I see little room for hesitation from the strictly theoretical point of view. Subjectivism seems the more rational scheme. And the world may, possibly, for aught I know, be nothing else. When the healthy love of life is on one, and all its forms and its appetites seem so unutterably real, when the most brutal and the most spiritual things are lit by the same sun, and each is an integral part of the total richness, why, then it seems a grudging and sickly way of meeting so robust a universe to shrink from any of its facts and wish them not to be. Rather, take the strictly dramatic point of view, and treat the whole thing as a great unending romance, which the spirit of the universe, striving to realize its own content, is eternally thinking out and representing to itself. End quote. Okay, slightly longer section there, but he's describing what he calls subjectivism in order to find as a escape from the pessimism that he previously described. And so the subjectivism, he says, basically that there must be found some good in the way things are as they are. He says the evil facts must be explained as seeming, the devil must be whitewashed, the universe must be disinfected. And of the various ways of operating this disinfection, the way of subjectivism appears to be the best. And subjectivism, what is subjectivism? He describes it, there's a nice little passage here I'll reread. He says, "Is there not something rather absurd in our ordinary notion of external things being good or bad in themselves?" In other words, an objective moral quality of this thing happening or that thing happening. And he says, can't you just sort of see it as like these things are only bad because there's someone who perceives the badness of it? Maybe it's the victim of the crime perceives the badness. Maybe it's us on thinking about the crime perceive the badness. Maybe we can all agree that it's bad. But it's bad insofar as we perceive the badness of it. Same thing with a paradise. Is a paradise really a paradise without any person to perceive it as a paradise? Our things, our actions, motions of matter, good or bad or evil, good or evil, without some consciousness perceiving it that way. He says, outward goods and evils seem practically indistinguishable except insofar as they result in getting moral judgments made about them. He says, then the moral judgments seem to be the main thing, and all of the outward facts are just instruments, perishing instruments, for the production of the moral judgments. The moral judgments about things are what matter, and not the things in themselves. And that, he says, is subjectivism. And he also says that, doesn't it seem like when pure goodness is described to us, it seems a little bit flat. Just angels playing harps in heaven. No strife, no drama, no conflict, no ever anything but this pure, eternal goodness. Doesn't it seem boring? Doesn't it seem a little bit not quite fulfilling? He says we look upon these things, these representations of utopia. He says we look upon them from this delicious mess of insanities and realities, strivings, deadnesses, hopes, fears, agonies, exaltations, which form our present state, and tedium vitae, the tedious life, is the only sentiment they awaken in our breasts. He says, such pictures of light upon light are vacuous and expressionless and neither to be enjoyed nor understood. He says, if this is the whole fruit of victory, if the generations of mankind suffered and laid down their lives, prophets confessed, martyrs sang in the fire, and all the sacred tears shed for no other end than this plucking of harps, this good upon good, light upon light, the sort of contented, inoffensive lives of such angelic beings as we could be in a world of perfect good. He says at such a rate it's better to lose than win the battle. Or at all events, it's better to bring the curtain down before the last act is concluded, so that a business that began so importantly can be saved from so singularly flat a winding up. And he's trying to sort of strongman the subjectivist argument, and yet it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? We're creatures of the world, and we thrive in struggle and conflict. And he says it's not the saint, but the sinner who repents, who knows the full breadth of existence. It's not just the elimination of vice we're after, but vice caught and held by virtue. That really seems like the ideal human state. And the last section that he says in that quote is interesting, where he says, when the healthy love of life is on one and all its forms and its appetites seem so unutterably real, when the most brutal and the most spiritual things are lit by the same sun, each is an integral part of total richness, he says, then it seems a grudging and sickly way of meeting so robust a universe to shrink from any of its facts and wish them not to be. Wish that this was different, wish that that was different. He says, it seems a grudging and sickly way of meeting the world to wish that it was something other than what it is. And it's kind of an appealing fix to the pessimism to just drink it all down, the good, the bad, the ugly, rather than to wish the world was made in some other way. But then he goes on and begins to criticize this subjectivism. And I think he makes some good, important points here. And I don't think that I completely agree with his premise, but I will say that he makes some good points. He says, quote, if we practically take up subjectivism, in a sincere and radical manner and follow its consequences, we meet with some that make us pause. Let a subjectivism begin in never so severe and intellectual a way, it is forced by the law of its nature to develop another side of itself, and end with the corruptest curiosity. Once dismiss the notion that certain duties are good in themselves and that we are here to do them, no matter how we feel about them, once consecrate the opposite notion that our performances and our violations of duty are for a common purpose, the attainment of subjective knowledge and feeling, and that the deepening of these is the chief end of our lives, and at what point on the downward slope are we to stop? In theology, subjectivism develops as its left wing antinomianism. In literature, its left wing is romanticism. And in practical life, it is either a nerveless sentimentality or a sensualism without bounds. Everywhere it fosters the fatalistic mood of mind. It makes those who are already too inert more passive still. It renders wholly reckless those whose energy is already in excess. All through history we find how subjectivism, as soon as it has a free career, exhausts itself in every sort of spiritual, moral, and practical license. Its optimism turns to an ethical indifference, which infallibly brings dissolution in its train. End quote. Basically just making a sort of a slippery slope argument here that if you're really just out to experience everything life has to offer, what are your limitations? Where are your moral limitations and where do they come from? Don't you just completely abandon your morals in order to find out what it's like to be the most hideous person in the world? Don't you just want to experience things without any regard for any duties or obligations to any other people? Aren't you just really trying to soak up everything for yourself in a sort of selfish way? For what reason would you have to not be utterly selfish in such a subjectivist world, in such a worldview? He goes on with that argument, or something along those lines, when he says, quote, "No writer of the French Romantic school has a word of rescue from the hour of satiety with the things of life, the hour in which we say, 'I take no pleasure in them,' or from the hour of terror at the world's vast meaningless grinding, if perchance such hours should come. For terror and satiety are facts of sensibility like any others, and at their own hour they reign in their own right. The heart of the romantic utterances, whether poetical, critical, or historical, is this inward remedilessness, what Carlyle calls this far-off whimpering of wail and woe. And from this romantic state of mind, there is absolutely no possible theoretic escape. Whether, like Renan, we look upon life in a more refined way as a romance of the spirit, or whether, like the friends of Major Zola, we pique ourselves on our scientific and analytic character and prefer to be cynical and call the world a Roman experiment on an infinite scale. In either case, the world appears to us potentially as what the same Carlyle once called it, a vast, gloomy, solitary Golgotha and mill of death. The only escape is by the practical way. And since I have mentioned the nowadays much reviled name of Carlyle, let me mention it once more, and say it is the way of his teaching. No matter for Carlyle's life, no matter for a great deal of his writing. What was the most important thing he said to us? He said, "Hang your sensibilities. Stop your sniveling complaints and your equally sniveling raptures. Leave off your general emotional tomfoolery and get to work like men." But this means a complete rupture with the subjectivist philosophy of things. It says conduct, and not sensibility, is the ultimate fact for our recognition. With the vision of certain works to be done, of certain outward changes to be wrought or resisted, it says our intellectual horizon terminates. No matter how we succeed in doing these outward duties, whether gladly and spontaneously, or heavily and unwillingly. Do them we somehow must, for the leaving of them undone is perdition. No matter how we feel, if we are only faithful in the outward act and refuse to do wrong, then the world will, in so far, be safe, and we quit of our debt toward it. Take, then, the yoke upon our shoulders, bend our neck beneath the heavy legality of its weight. Regard something else than our feeling as our limit, our master, and our law. Be willing to live and die in its service, and at a stroke we have passed from the subjective into the objective philosophy of things. Much as one awakens from some feverish dream, full of bad lights and noises, to find oneself bathed in the sacred coolness and quiet of the air of the night. But what is the essence of this philosophy of objective conduct, so old-fashioned and finite, but so chaste and sane and strong when compared with this romantic rival? It is the willingness, after bringing about some external good, to feel at peace, for our responsibility ends with the performance of that duty, and the burden of the rest we may lay on higher powers. End quote. Okay, so I like this section. He basically says that none of the romantic writers have any word of rescue, no way out of what they describe, just subjectively taking, it's kind of an inactive, right? It's experiencing this, experiencing that, experiencing the other. And happiness has its place, and sadness has its place, and all of the things have their place in the world. And we're sort of passively watching the waves go by. We're just experiencing things. And whether you want to experience it this way or that way, ultimately, there's no reason to do any one thing or any other thing. And he says the only escape from this is the practical way. And he talks about Carlyle. And he says, what was the most important thing that Carlyle ever said? He said, get to work. Stop your raptures and your complaints, your emotional tomfoolery, and start fixing things, start doing things, start acting in the world. And he says that conduct and not sensibility then is the ultimate fact for our recognition. And he says, what I think is interesting, he says, no matter how we feel, if we're only faithful in the outward act and refuse to do wrong, the world will insofar be safe, and we quit of our debt toward it. In other words, you sort of have a debt to the world, which is something that he just brings up and doesn't go into any detail about such a notion, but a debt to the world that you're here and you're experiencing this and you've gained something from that, and you owe it to the world to try to improve it, to try to pursue some goal, some end, some activity in the world to make it a better world. And that doesn't like the deterministic worldview doesn't give you the option of doing things like that. And I think is where it doesn't add up to me, that the world can be purely deterministic and you can still have a sense of gratitude and a sense of duty and a sense of obligation to do things in the world to make the world more like, and let's leave off the question for now of what it means for the world to be better or worse, but in somehow you have some obligation to do something in the world that conforms with your vision, perhaps, or a vision agreed upon by members of your society as to what it means for the world to be better. Where you get the explanation of, this is a worse scenario and this is a better scenario. Maybe you feel it intuitively. Maybe you hear the story about the murderer, the guy who murdered his wife and smashed her skull in with a stone, and you instinctively feel or sense that there's something evil or bad or destructive or unpleasant about it, and you think it would be a better world if that didn't happen, and then you take action to prevent such things from happening. But where did you get that sense that such an act is wrong, that murder is wrong? Where did you get that sense? Does it matter? Did you intuitively feel it? Did you get it from your society that you learned such things are wrong? Did you learn about it in church? Where did you get it? Does it matter? And I guess I think that determinism in no way invalidates our obligations to the world, because we act according to a wide variety of factors, internal and external, that guide our behavior. And I don't think that there is any reason why a deterministic worldview would command you to accept a world in which there are murders like that. Now, I've talked in the past about how we don't. It's not possible for us to perfect the world, and the sort of constraints we'd have to apply to the world in order to make sure that no bad thing ever happens would be probably a cure worse than the disease. But to want to improve your society, to want to improve the condition of the planet Earth and the people who live there, to want to make something better is itself like a hardwired component of the human experience. I don't think it demands the repudiation of determinism and the affirmation of free will to prompt people to want to act in the world and not just to absorb it and watch it pass by and think, isn't this all nice how it all unfolds, to just take a perfectly passive role. I don't think that determinism demands a passive role, but that's just me. Let's see what he says here in closing in on the conclusion of this essay, where he says, quote, "This brings us right back, after such a long detour, to the question of indeterminism, and to the conclusion of all I came here to say tonight. For the only consistent way of representing a pluralism and a world whose parts may affect one another through their conduct, being either good or bad, is the indeterministic way. What interest, zest, or excitement can there be in achieving the right way, unless we are enabled to feel that the wrong way is also a possible and a natural way, nay, more, a menacing and an imminent way? And what sense can there be in condemning ourselves for taking the wrong way, unless we need have done nothing of the sort, unless the right way was open to us as well? I cannot understand the willingness to act, no matter how we feel, without the belief that acts are really good and bad. I cannot understand the belief that an act is bad without regret at its happening. I cannot understand regret without the admission of real, genuine possibilities in the world. Only then is it other than a mockery to feel, after we have failed to do our best, that an irreparable opportunity is gone from the universe, the loss of which it must forever after mourn. If you insist that this is all superstition, that possibility is in the eye of science and reason impossibility, and that if I act badly, 'tis that the universe was foredoomed to suffer this defect, you fall right back into the dilemma, the labyrinth of pessimism and subjectivism, from out of whose toils we have just found our way." End quote. And I guess that's really where I disagree with him, that if something can't be determined as good and bad outside of the subjective view of it, then what purpose is there in doing any of it? I guess I think that our will to act is itself determined. Our failure to act is determined. And what seems to be a choice between acting and failing to act is a sort of illusion. And I guess I think that free will itself is an illusion. And that's not maybe the intuitive way of understanding things. But that's what I think. All of our scientific experiments and studies of the world have pointed toward determinism. And the only thing that really points toward indeterminism is how we feel. We feel free. We feel like we choose. We feel like we must be able to choose. In order to do good things, we must be able to choose to do those good things. It must be something we have decided and not something that we just did because we had no other choice. It feels like we have free will. But it also feels like the earth isn't moving, and it feels like the sun rises and sets and moves across the sky, and those things aren't true. They're illusions. And once we study and understand, we can see through the illusion. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. Thank you very much for listening, and I will catch you on the flip side.